טלוויזיה? תוכניות רגילות או חדשות אולי?
לדעתי תוכניות רגילות. אני יודעת שחשוב וטוב לשמוע חדשות ולהיות ערנים למצב, אבל זה יותר מעציב וזה גורם לנו לראות איך המצב איכשהו עם כל החבלות.
היית רוצה להיות משהו ניטרלי או שמח? או משהו, נגיד, אני שואל את זה בכלל, נגיד, את חושבת שמשהו משמח זה דבר יותר אפקטיבי כדי להקל, או שלא צריך להקל, או שמה צריך לעשות?
לדעתי יותר שמח. יותר להתגבר על המצב. אבל זה קשה, וכולם יודעים את זה, לפי כל התוכניות שתמיד מזכירים את זה ברדיו ובחדשות.
מה את עשית אחר הצהריים אתמול?
לבד, אני שמעתי חדשות עם ההורים שלי, ורציתי לראות, ויותר להבין.
טוב, אחרים? אני זכרתי אתכם לפי סדר השמות, ועכשיו בלבלו אותי. כן, יש טלפון?
אחד? הלו?
הלו?
שלום.
כן?
שלום.
עם מי אנחנו מדברים?
זה אמסלם שלמה מבת ים.
ושלמה, יש לך איזו שאלה למישהו מהאורחים שלנו?
רציתי לשאול את סיוון.
כן.
את סיוון רציתי לשאול אותה כמה שאלות.
בבקשה, סיוון שומעת.
סיוון, תגידי, איך זה היה בקשר לפיגוע של האוטובוס קו 5 בדיזינגוף?
לא שמענו את השאלה שלך, שלמה, כל כך. תחזור בבקשה.
איך היה הפיגוע של האוטובוס בקו 5 בדיזינגוף?
איך היה? באיזה מובן איך היה?
איך הרגשת שנפל לך פתאום השרשרת של החמסה?
השרשרת נפלה לי הרי לפני הפיגוע, כאילו לפני הפיצוץ עצמו, אז
כן.
זה אולי נראה לי מוזר, אבל לא קישרתי בין הדברים בכלל. זה לא נראה לי כמו משהו שהולך לקרות עכשיו, או שעכשיו אני צריכה להיזהר, כי הרי משהו גרם לי ללכת אחורה, כאילו, זה בכלל לא נראה לי ככה.
איפה את שמעת על הפיגוע, סיוון? שלמה, תודה רבה לך.
בבוקר.
בבית ספר?
לא הלכתי לבית ספר, היה לי את הצילומים האלה.
לא, אני מדבר
על הפיגוע אתמול.
כן.
הייתה בשחזור.
אתמול זה היה שחזור.
כן.
יאללה, איזה...
זה מין...
אינטנסיביות.
ובהתחלה באמת, כאילו, אבא שלי צלצל בבוקר. וכזה, שאל אותי מה, כאילו, כי גם ככה שבוע לפני זה הייתי לגמרי לחוצה בגלל זה. שאל אותי איך אני מסודרת וזה. אני רוצה שהכל בסדר. והוא ביקש את אמא שלי. ונשארתי על הקו, ואמרתי, טוב, אני פשוט אגיד את זה, היה פיגוע עכשיו. אותו רגע, לא ידעתי מה לעשות, אז כאילו... לא יודעת, לא בכיתי, נראה לי. אם בכיתי, אז לא שמתי לב. אבל הייתי בטוחה שאני לא רוצה לעשות את זה. אמרתי, אין, זהו, אני לא עושה את זה, כאילו, רוצה שחזור באותו יום, כי זה בכלל, כאילו... אמרתי לעצמי, אין, זהו, אני לא מסוגלת לעשות את זה. והלך, כאילו, בהתחלה חשבתי אולי לטלפן, ואז כאילו, בסוף הגענו לשם, איפה שקבענו, והחלטתי שכן, וזה, שבחוסר הרבה ברירות אני כן אעשה את השחזור, וחשבתי שבכלל היום, אבל איכשהו היום הזה דווקא די השכיח את מה שהיה, לצערי. אבל בעיקרון אחרי פיגועים אני לא מסתדרת עם זה כל כך טוב, כאילו, אתמול זה היה...
יותר קשה.
יותר קל דווקא, כמה שזה מוזר, היה לי יותר קל.
יותר קל מיום רגיל או
מפיגועים, כאילו, משאר...
מפיגועים קודמים.
כן.
טוב.
סיוון, יש כאן פקס בשבילך. שמעתי אותך בתוכנית, הסיפור שלך ריגש אותי מאוד, שדיברת על איך התגברת על הפחד. הבנתי שגם אני אוכל להתגבר על הפחד שלי. תודה שעזרת לי, טל מחיפה.
את יכולה לשמור את זה מבחינתנו. תודה לטל מחיפה. אנחנו רוצים לעשות עוד הפסקה למוזיקה, או עוד לא? מה אומרים? כן, נעשה הפסקה למוזיקה. אז כפי שאמרנו לכם, כבר נמצאים איתנו אנסמבל רננים. ולפני שהם מתחילים לנגן, תסלחו לי על השינוי בתוכניות, אבל יש כאן כלי שיש רק אחד כמוהו בארץ. אתם רואים? זה החליל הגדול ביותר שראיתי מאתכם. שלום. איך קוראים לך?
יהודה.
יהודה? תגיד לנו איך קוראים לזה?
סוב-בס.
סוב-בס, וזה כלי שהוא עצמו, לא... החתיכת עץ הזאת שאתם רואים כאן היא בת 300 שנה, נכון? בערך?
כן.
1595. 301 לא זייפנו בהרבה. ומה אתם הולכים לנגן לנו עכשיו?
זה מנואט של מוצרט, מתוך דון ג'וואני.
אנסמבל רננים. בואו נשמע. תודה רבה לאנסמבל רננים, ועכשיו יש עוד מישהו
שאלה
בקהל, סיוון, שרוצה לשאול אותך משהו.
מעוז, נכון?
סיוון, מה המקום של החברים שלך ביציאה מהמשבר הזה, אחרי שעברת את הפיגוע?
זה עיקרי. והם עזרו לי המון גם בלי שהם ידעו. מספיק זה שאיכשהו, כאילו, כמה זה נשמע מוזר, איכשהו אני שומעת את הקול שלהם. ומדברים איתי, וגם אם לא יודעים שאני מרגישה נורא מבפנים, זה עוזר. ובמיוחד שאני ממש אומרת שאני לא יכולה, והם יודעים שאני באותו רגע באיזשהו מצב שאני ממש לא מרגישה טוב, והם גם כן באים ועוזרים ומחבקים ואומרים שהכל יהיה בסדר.
והם גם הגיעו אותך לפה, אותם חברים שהיו איתך כל התקופה הזאת.
טוב, אנחנו מסיימים כאן בעצם. סיוון, תודה רבה לך. תודה רבה לדוקטור ענבר. תודה רבה לילדים שבאו אלינו לאולפן ולאנסמבל רננים. ותודה גם לכם שהייתם איתנו.
In Jerusalem's French Hill, an apparent terror attack turns out to be a tragic accident.
Victims of yesterday's murderous bombings are laid to rest.
And in a subdued Knesset, Prime Minister Peres calls on Arafat to outlaw terrorists, and Netanyahu pledges support for all-out campaign against terror. Good evening from IBA News in Jerusalem. Further tragedy in Jerusalem this afternoon. 2 people were killed and more than 20 others injured after a car driven by an Arab American crashed into a bus stop in the French Hill neighborhood. The driver of the car was shot dead. Police investigators now believe that the incident was not a terror attack as first thought, but might have been a car accident. Steve Leibowitz has the story.
At 3 o'clock this afternoon, a Palestinian American driving a rented black Fiat Uno drove into a large group of Israelis waiting at a bus stop in French Hill. 2 persons were killed and about 15 wounded, most of them with light to moderate injuries. Whether the incident is a terrorist attack or an accident has yet to be clarified. Some witnesses said that the driver deliberately ran a red light and at high speed drove directly into the crowd. The driver, identified as Ahmed Abdel Hamida, then got out of the car and, according to at least one witness, yelled, "Allahu Akbar, God is great." 2 armed bystanders, possibly policemen who witnessed the scene, pulled out their weapons and shot and killed the driver. Other shots may have been fired by civilians. Police at first believed the car, which was rented in Jerusalem, might have contained explosives, but a check by sappers found that it was not. Police Commissioner Asaf Chafetz arrived on the scene. After preliminary investigation, Chafetz said he believed the incident was probably a terrorist attack, although the possibility that the car went out of control was not ruled out. The police are checking whether there is evidence that the driver attempted to brake. But after further investigation, Jerusalem Police Commissioner Aryeh Amit said that evidence was now pointing to the likelihood that it was an accident. Amit also said that one of the misdirected bullets fired by an Israeli may have killed one of the victims. Ambulances arriving on the scene evacuated most of the wounded to Hadassah Hospital in Mount Scopus. The hospital is located only a short distance from the scene of the attack, a main intersection connecting Jerusalem to Ramallah and remote to French Hill.
Jerusalem was in mourning today for the victims of yesterday's terror bombing, which claimed 24 lives in the capital. Funerals took place one after the other at Mount Herzl's military cemetery, while others were laid to rest at Givat Shaul. 41 casualties from the attacks in Jerusalem and Ashkelon remain hospitalized. 19 of them are still in serious condition. Robert Sana filed this report on Jerusalem a day after the devastating attack.
Throughout the country today, a solemn nation mourned the victims of yesterday's terrorist bombings. Perhaps it's an accumulation of grief from all the terrorism in recent years. But certainly the Jerusalem and Ashkelon attacks seem to have left Israelis with an even deeper sense of national sorrow and despair than in the past. This morning, the feeling of insecurity and anguish was especially pervasive in the capital, where hundreds converged on a corner lot next to where 22 Israelis and 2 Americans were blown to pieces a day earlier. People said prayers and lit candles for the dead. Some arranged candles to spell the Hebrew word for enough. Others huddled around memorial fires and wrote messages on a blank white banner, many hostile to the government. Elsewhere, the front pages of today's newspapers placed at makeshift shrines at the site, served as a grisly reminder of the carnage. "The heart is broken," said a blood-red banner headline in Yediot Achronot, above 2 rows of photographs of victims ranging in age from 16 to 62. At schools, students stood for a minute of silence in respect to those who perished. At Jerusalem's Beit Chinuch High School, a black draped table was placed near the entrance, with candles and pictures of 3 recent graduates killed yesterday. At the city's Mount Herzl Military Cemetery, 5 soldiers were buried in grim succession. The bodies of Sara Duker and Matthew Eisenfeld, the 2 Americans killed yesterday who were engaged to be married, are being flown to the United States later today for burial. Those riding buses today did so almost with trepidation and a sense of defiance, determined not to let terrorists rule their lives, but at the same time, privately wondering if they would reach their destination. The impact of yesterday's attacks was further compounded by the lull in Palestinian terrorism since last summer, which had left some people hoping that the spate of terrorist bombings was finally a thing of the past. In light of yesterday's attacks, the deadliest against Israel since 1978, it's certain that today nobody is entertaining such wishful illusions. This is Robert Sarner for IBA News.
In the United States, more than 200 friends gathered today in New York to mourn 25-year-old Matthew Eisenfeld and his girlfriend Sara Duker, killed in yesterday's bomb blast in Jerusalem. Sara was studying at the Hebrew University, and Matthew was a second-year student at the Jewish Theological Seminary in Jerusalem. With us in the studio is Eddie Bernstein, a classmate of Matthew's and a friend of both Matthew and Sara. Eddie, this must be a very difficult day for you.
It's been very difficult for everyone who knew and loved Matt and Sara, as I have for several years already. They're both so kind and loving and generous, and more than that, they stood for Klal Yisrael. They were active in many different kinds of Jewish organizations. They studied in many different kinds of Jewish institutions, Orthodox, conservative, and they had friends in all these different factions, and they stood above denominationalism.
How do other foreign students like yourself feel about being in Israel after something like this happens? Very briefly.
Well, it's scary, but I know life goes on, and I'm committed to my studies for this year.
Eddie Bernstein, thank you very much for joining us. The confused events on French Hill came a short time before the opening of the Knesset debate on yesterday's 2 bombing attacks. David Essing reports.
Prime Minister Peres began by saying that at that very moment the authorities were still clarifying the details of what had happened at French Hill. He said an American citizen of Arab descent, Ahmed Abdul Hamida, had driven a Fiat car into a group of people waiting at a bus stop, injuring up to 15. 2 were apparently killed. And Peres added it may be a terrorist attack, but until everything is checked, there is no room for guesswork. Turning to yesterday's bombings, the Prime Minister said the country was now facing diabolical suicide bombers who were targeting all Israelis. He had ordered all the security forces to give top priority to combating the terrorism, and a supreme effort was now being made. Peres and Likud leader Benjamin Netanyahu had earlier reached a gentleman's agreement that their 2 parties would not interrupt each other's speeches. This did not apply to Moledet Rechavam Zevi, who blamed the Prime Minister for lifting the closure last Friday. Turning to Yasser Arafat, the Prime Minister said there was no value to the PLO's recent election victory if a minority of armed men could torpedo its policies. And he added, the Palestinian Authority must decide either to disarm the terrorists or let them jeopardize its power. The PA had to outlaw those who were acting outside of the law, and this is what the agreement obligated. The Prime Minister repeated that while Israel would not halt the peace process, it would strike the terrorists with all its force wherever and whenever they could be found. Likud leader Benjamin Netanyahu also referred first to French Hill. He said that in these very moments we are burying our dead, there was news of yet another attack. The Arab terrorism was trying to break Israel's spirit, he declared, but they would never succeed. But this was not a day for recriminations and debate, he added. Israel must stand united to defeat those who would destroy her. Netanyahu then turned to the Prime Minister saying, Shimon, fight these terrorists with all Israel's might. Fight them and you will have our full support. And he concluded, members of the Knesset, let us all agree that no matter what government, we will never allow the terrorists to succeed. David Essing, IBA News, the Knesset.
In Jerusalem, Foreign Minister Ehud Barak today called on donor nations to the Palestinian Authority to apply pressure on Yasser Arafat to smash the terror infrastructure in the Gaza Strip and the autonomous enclaves. Barak spoke during a special meeting with international ambassadors this afternoon in the Foreign Ministry. Barak convened the diplomats in the wake of yesterday's twin terror attacks in Jerusalem and Ashkelon. Prior to the meeting, the Foreign Minister told IBA News that he supports an indefinite closure of the territories as a security measure.
We do know that the Hamas infrastructure is still there. My judgment is that it should be maintained as long as needed, period. It might take weeks, it might take months. It should be maintained as long as needed. I don't see any kind of contradiction with the peace process. It's part of the agreement. When it comes to security, we are responsible to defend our people, and we are going to do it.
And with the signs that the closure on the territories will in fact be a lengthy one, there are increasing protests from Palestinian leaders. Dennis Zinn reports on the closure that has been reimposed in the wake of yesterday's terrorist bombings.
The closure on the territories was total today as people, vehicles and goods were prevented from passing from the territories into Israel. Following yesterday's suicide bombing attacks, Prime Minister and Defense Minister Shimon Peres ordered the usual steps to be taken after such events: a closure on Judea, Samaria and Gaza, a reinforcement of troops along the Green Line and stringent examinations at the checkpoints. But this time, sources close to the Prime Minister's office say the closure will be lengthy. In Bethlehem today, Palestinian businessmen complained that if the closure continues, their economy will grind to a halt, because even their local consumers depend on Israeli salaries. This is not fair, they say, and called it collective punishment. Finance Minister Avraham Shochat said he would prefer to call it collective security for the residents of Israel. Our security, he says, has priority over the Palestinian economy. We would like them to succeed, and we would feel differently if we knew that the Palestinian Authority was doing all it could to fight terrorism. But this is not the case. Palestinian Finance Minister Abu Ala said today the Palestinian Authority is unable to bear the effect of a lengthy closure.
Closure means destroy the weak Palestinian economy. We don't have an economy. We are still in the way to build our economy. But much closure will kill this economy.
Meanwhile, in Beirut, Hamas representative Mustafa Ali Dawi said his group carried out yesterday's two attacks to avenge the killing of their master bomb maker, Yihya Ayash. Dennis Zinn, IBA News.
President Ezer Weizmann today visited wounded victims of yesterday's bomb attack in Ashkelon. The president said yesterday's attacks were the worst Israel has known, and that their perpetrators intended causing the country's collapse. This is not a battle for peace, said Weizmann, but a battle for the state of Israel. The president noted the restraint of the country's political leaders in the wake of the bombings, in contrast to previous terrorist attacks. And in South Lebanon, 2 IDF soldiers were lightly wounded this morning in a Hezbollah attack on IDF and SLA positions. Lebanese sources say Hezbollah fired mortars and rocket-propelled grenades on an Israeli Merkava tank near the Beaufort Castle in the security zone. According to the sources, the 2 wounded soldiers were outside the tank at the time of the attack.
Yigal Amir, his brother Chagai Amir and Dror Adani today pleaded innocent to plotting the murder of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. Appearing in Tel Aviv District Court at the start of their trial, the 3 denied conspiring to kill Rabin on November 4th. Yigal Amir has admitted pulling the trigger, but says he intended only to paralyze the Prime Minister. The attorneys of Chagai Amir and Dror Adani said their clients did not know about Yigal Amir's intent to kill Rabin and that investigators used psychological pressure to force them to confess. Yigal Amir's trial resumes on the 3rd of March. He's expected to testify on his own behalf a few days later. In financial news, the governor of the Bank of Israel has decided not to change the interest rate for the month of March. The governor said public spending no longer exceeds economic activity and does not pose an inflationary risk. In other money matters, share prices on the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange were fractionally up today. The Ma'of was up 0.07%, while the index rose 0.1%. Trading totaled 81 million shekels. And today's foreign currency exchange rate has the US dollar at 310 shekels, the British pound at 4.78, and the German mark at 2.14 shekels. And the weather will be clear to partly cloudy with local rain in the north and centre of the country. Here are the highs and lows for tonight and tomorrow.
And that brings us to an end of today's edition of IBA News. We'll be back tomorrow at 6:15.
Until then, thanks for joining us, and shalom from Jerusalem.
مشاهدي الكرام، أسعد الله مساءكم وأهلا بكم في فترتنا العربية لهذا المساء من التلفزيون الإسرائيلي من أورشليم القدس. بعد قليل نقدم برنامج وثائقي بعنوان الوثوق بالدببة، وفي 7 النشرة الإخبارية المصورة. سيداتي سادتي، أحلى الأوقات أرجوها لكم معنا.
This week, an intrepid camera team on the trail of a rare and ghostly creature.
Hey, Bear. Hey, Bear. It's just me, Bear. Just me coming, Bear. It's just me. Hey, Bear. Attaboy. Just me. Just coming up to take your picture. Hey, Bear. Hey, Bear. Just me. Just me, Bear. Just still can't quite believe it.
Dangerous, aggressive, unpredictable. Bears are feared, animals to avoid. This one appears blissfully unaware of its fearsome reputation. The west coast of Canada is fringed by wild, remote, uninhabited islands. Here lives an animal rich in legend, a rare white bear. Untouched by the human world, could this be the place to see the true nature of the bear? An elusive, almost ghostly animal, living on a magical island. What could be more irresistible?
עוד פיוסים, עוד עונה.
1, 2, 3, push!
שום דבר לא אישי מדי בשביל החיות.
Gotcha again. Oh my God! I could have been a star!
Babe, I'd trade everything I got for a family like this.
החיות, הפרקים החדשים, החל מיום...
Hello, Johnny. Tim couldn't make it. He's in love. Isn't that wonderful?
Oh, it's enchanted.
Here's the TV. I know you wanted to watch the Super Bowl.